should talk. Hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you guys?
We're okay. We're just we have the people not here yet that I expected to be here, but that's okay. Let's all kind of squish in a little bit.
Justin, you're coming in a little bit. You're coming in a little bit delayed. Let me just change. No, you don't think so? Okay, hold on. All right. Can you hear us? Okay.
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Wunderbar. All right. I'm gonna get my cheat sheet here. Make sure I don't forget anything. And then,
Good morning, students.
Hi, class. Oh, it's Friday morning.
So this is I'll introduce you to some friends of mine. This is Mike and Meg. They're excellent. Well, first, most importantly, they're great. They're great people, but also fantastic filmmakers in the doc world. They also do branded content as well, but their hearts are in the doc land. And I've known them for probably about 10 years now or so, and we've worked together in lots of things, and we've over the course of that we've become really good friends, and I just want to give them opportunity to chat with you guys, because they're really great people. They're a great resource. You know a ton about what they do. They work all over the world. I can't keep track of wherever they are. So anyway, I would love for you guys first to tell us a little bit about yourselves and your background and why you do what you do. And I'd love to just kind of start there, and then we can kind of go through and if there's any questions at the end, we'd love to have the opportunity for those.
That sounds great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you. As Justin mentioned, Mike and I work together. We have a production company that we move between kind of different types or different silos of content, that being kind of branded content, documentary, and then kind of a social impact. But kind of, I think the common theme between all of those different silos is a documentary approach. So approach to storytelling that comes from kind of a nonfiction point of view, or a verite or observational point of view. I know authenticity is kind of like a big buzzword in the storytelling land right now, but we do try to kind of bring to the table kind of a set of values or a perspective when we tell stories that involves real people and capturing their stories, even if that is for a commercial or for a branded piece. Our approach is very much influenced by kind of our background in documentary. So we can talk a little bit more about kind of how we got into what we got into and what our different kind of educational paths were that took us here. But as a company, as Persistent Productions, that's kind of the overview, so to speak.
And from a more infrastructure standpoint, we spend half of our time in Asia. We have an office in Singapore. And so we spend about 6 months every year in our office in Singapore. And then we come back to the US and we spend anywhere between 3 to 6 months in the US. We live up in Boston and we have an office down in New York. So it's quite a commute to get to all of our offices. We have an editor on staff and an associate producer on staff. And they also live in areas that we do not have offices. They're completely mobile. So, we have our editors in California, our associate producers in Boston, and then sometimes we pick up some talent when we need them in Singapore. So kind of this globalized, very, very small production company. And, we think we utilize that, the time zone differences to our benefit. When we have projects, we can kind of work around the clock should we need to.
That's great. That's really helpful. I would love to hear sort of how you ended up in the position there you are. You have a small business and with a footprint internationally. Rewind till to about right now. All these students are juniors and seniors. They're most of them have films, and they're involved in filmmaking and interested in directing or editing. There's some music people in here as well. What top line thoughts, I guess, based on where you were, and sort of for the direction you took, but also obviously times are different. I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of your own individual paths, and also sort of what your thoughts are, your top line thoughts are on these days, what's happening these days, and sort of how technology and how that's changed the development of people going into the industry.
Totally. I always loved asking people this question because I was so curious because film is, so diverse across all of these different areas of expertise. I was always so curious about how people got into like their area of focus. But Mike and I kind of come from two different, I'd say, like educational backgrounds in terms of our approach to film. So I came from a more like fine arts, liberal arts background in terms of my area of focus of study. So I studied art and art history, and then went on to get a master's of fine arts. And so during that process, I was at school in Washington, D.C., which is a pretty good place actually for production and kind of nonfiction filmmaking. At the time, National Geographic was based there, which they still are. Discovery was based there. Smithsonian Channel, obviously a bunch of news. And so I started working at a company called Washington Media Associates. That was my first kind of like internship or foray into documentary. At the time, they were doing a lot of long form investigative journalism. So you got like Peter Jennings, Bill Moyers, kind of long form 1 hour specials that looked at a particular issue from a journalistic perspective. And what I really kind of fell in love with was the combination of visual research, so editing and kind of like the visuals and the footage and the archival research, and being able to make that kind of current in the world today. So how was that like impacting our lives today? I liked the journalism element of what was included. And the person that I work for was a real, trained in a real kind of old school, hard-nosed journalism way. So really close with like people at the New Yorker and Bill Moyers, and that kind of like really just amazing kind of ethical approach to journalism. And so as a student, that really inspired me to want to work in that field. It was a very different media world at the time. So you were looking at tape-based media. I'm laughing because it's like, it feels really dated. And Michael will segue to Mike. But from there, I made a lot of like friends in kind of the production world in DC. And we started collaborating on stuff as I went on to graduate school. Being in that world of people working on kind of like different independent projects, traveling a lot internationally, and doing kind of the combination of work projects and passion projects at some of the bigger channels, I kind of fell in love with just the industry and documentary. I can talk a little bit more about, then we can kind of segue and talk about how our production company came to be and like what I think about the industry now. But I'll segue to Mike's bio before I do that.
And so I went to the same university, George Washington University. And the first semester of my freshman year, I did an internship. And I did an internship at National Geographic. And at the same time, I was kind of deciding, I knew I wanted to do something in the visual arts, but I didn't quite know if it was going to be filmmaking or photography or whatever. But really that internship pushed me into really wanted to get to learn more about filmmaking and about, the world of how to make films, both creatively, but also from kind of a business aspect. So I picked up as many courses as I could and ended up finishing what then was called electronic media at George Washington University, which they don't have anymore as a graduating degree. But what I did do, and this goes back to, what's that?
No, I was going to say, I was just gonna make a joke about how it was called electronic media, and I think everything is electronic now. So
yeah,
and it's like the media of the future. It's electronic. It's like
sorry to interrupt you, Mike.
Terrible.
Well, and what's interesting about that is, and it's probably hard sitting in 2018 to remember this or to think that this actually happened. But when I was an intern at National Geographic, I was interning in the equipment room. And so what I learned very quickly was that I could provide value to people who were coming through the equipment room. These are people that had been working in television and film for 20, 30 years. And they were turning to me and asking me about how certain things worked. So these guys have produced hours and hours of Emmy-nominated, Emmy Award-winning television, and they were asking me about the technicals, right? So they're asking me about like, well, if this tape, you know, if I use this tape, how do I get it to look like this? Or if I use this camera, what kind of process do I need to use to get it into the edit bay? And so I learned quickly that the value that I could add was to learn about all of the very, very specific equipment that could be used at that time. And this is crazy. At that time, I thought it was moving fast. At that time, we were working at like, maybe there's a new camera coming out every 3 to 5 years. As you guys know, every 6 months, these companies are putting out a new camera, right? Now, depending on what camera it is, it might be really different or pretty much the same. But the point here is I was an intern at a time when tape-based media was 99% of what was happening. By the time I left National Geographic in 2008, so 10 years ago, there wasn't a single, if I remember correctly, there wasn't a single production that was filmed on a tape-based camera. Everything was a digital, as we now know, a digital camera, right? Back then it was a Panasonic Varicam.
Electronic media.
Yeah, you might call it electronic media. And so what's interesting about that is, and I guess how I can answer your question, Justin, is the terminology and the equipment that I was learning, while the names changed and some of the functions changed, the fundamental basis of how it all worked together really hasn't changed. It's just either condensed everything into one, or we found different software to do a lot of what the hardware used to do. And so me kind of getting to where we are now came from a very specific learning and educating myself about what all of the equipment that could be used is, how to define that, and then really how to talk about it, right? How you would use A and C or A and D, and how that might change the way the end film looks or the end result.
Yeah, that's all great. I love to do a kind of segue a bit here and think about obviously we're talking about here the landscape and technology is certainly changed, but certainly the industry in terms of the business side, what was before a handful of very large conglomerates is now really broken up into much smaller companies. You know, I do stuff with CNN and Great Big Story, which is a division of CNN. You've got Vice, and you've got, you know, there's and then you've got all these over-the-top networks like Amazon Prime and Netflix and this and that. There's a lot more opportunity. I feel like now. But but they're really broken up into these. There's a niche here and a niche there, and every company is trying to grab at different genres of work, and certainly technology has helped that. What I'm interested is, and obviously you guys have seen sort of both sides of it. I would love to sort of understand the process by which you work. So obviously you wear kind of two hats. You wear the branded hat, you wear the doc hat. And I love just a sort of a brief rundown on how things start. You have an idea, or an idea is brought to you, how you go through the research process, the pre-production, going into production, and sort of how that, what is the same indifferent sort of in the branded side and the doc side, because I feel like there's always the heart in the doc, and there's the desire. I think on the music side, it's like making albums, you know, but certainly because of income, because of jobs, people want to work and have a family or a home or a car or whatever. You get pushed into the branded side. So anyway, there's certain things that are the same, certain things are different. I would love to sort of hear what your process is, so these guys can understand as they start undertaking their first projects outside of school, sort of how things go.
Yeah, sure. So we kind of, again, came of an age professionally during the middle of this transition, which I feel like put us in a really advantageous position, actually, because I think people in the generation just prior to us maybe had a harder time. I can't speak for them, but in a sense, we were kind of coming out of working for like big networks and big industry when we were starting, and thought, okay, we'll make like long form, one-off independent films and sell those and make a living, which is it's kind of coming back around, ironically, with all the Netflix specials, but for the last 10 years, it really hasn't been a feasible way of like making a day-to-day income. But because our kind of creative interests were in that doc space, like we always knew we wanted to pursue that kind of regardless. And so we were pretty dogged about, if we found a story, figuring out creative ways of getting that funded and figuring out ways to tell the story. And so that put us kind of early in our company history, about 10 years ago, finding some stories in the doc space that we were looking for unusual funding from. So yes, there's the grants and all of that stuff is amazing. But as a young filmmaker, sometimes it's hard because the grants seem to always go to the people that they've gone to for the last 20 years. And so we found ourselves kind of approaching people in what is now known as branded content, but then kind of wasn't known as anything, approaching investors or financiers or companies or agencies to fund some documentary projects that we were interested in telling those stories. And so even as far back, Justin, is one of our like most favorite collaboration on the Lakshmi story, which is an independent film that we had at Tribeca. That was actually paid for by a hotel company. So that was like very unusual at the time. That was probably like 2011, 2012. But it was a story that we really wanted to have told. And so we said kind of these are the parameters and this is how we're going to kind of build out that contractually so that it stays as an independent film and not a commercial. But it put us in a position where we were very, I would say, open to the idea of working between those two, working between the documentary world and the branded content world, and kind of keeping our ethos in check in both places. And so,
hey, Meg, I always want to pause 1 second. So they're referring to a doc they did that I worked on with them in the post phase, so in the spirit of Lakshmi. It's about a leopard in India that was abandoned by its mom and was raised by this man out there. But what's interesting about it is you see lots of animal docs about companion animals. We're reacquainted with families and stuff. But what's very interesting about this one was this man raised the leopard as the animal, as the leopard. So he taught it how to hunt and how to climb, and really fascinating. And then at the end, he releases the animal into the wild. And it's really amazing. But what they're referring to, which is actually, this is a really good project to think about, because it's sort of it's only a branded project in the sense that it was funded. This happened, was it near the hotel? Was it on the grounds of it? There's a reason why the hotel, a very high-end hotel, decided to invest into this project and tell this story. So there's no branding present in the film itself. It just happened to be funded, which is amazing, which is the dream, right? You get somebody rich or a corporation to give you a bunch of money, but not need you to hype them.
And that's kind of like the best version of branded content that exists, is more, it sounds more like underwriting
Right.
And branded content. And there are companies out there that believe that that's what they should be doing. And again, I wanted to pick up on the idea of storytelling.
And that's something to think about for your own film project, is how you acquire resources. There's grants, obviously, that Megan knows lots about. There's the grant process, and there's a host of arts-based grant and government-funded and all of that stuff. But what like Mike's referring to is sort of like this project in particular was sort of like almost a grant-based thing within the context of corporate industry, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that the concept of storytelling for brands is, in the last 5 to 6 years, has become a more an easier thing for brands to get their minds around. And I think that, again, if we look at it as a parallel track of technology, when the Lakshmi film that we did together came out, there was no iPhone. And if there was an iPhone, there was no YouTube. Like by the time we finished it, there was, but YouTube wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. There was no, Facebook was around, but people weren't using it for video. So the idea that like branded content was a thing back then couldn't really be realized, because there was no place for the brands to put their video stories to the people, to the public, right? And so now I think
you're not going to air a branded video on broadcast network. No one's going to watch it.
And so now with the ability for brands to very, very cheaply connect with as many people as we all know those numbers get to, the ability for a filmmaker to bring a story to a brand, or inversely, for a brand to bring a story to a filmmaker, and have a filmmaker really, really bring that story to the screen, it's the first time in history that it's happened, that we've been able to, as filmmakers, potentially connect with this many people so cheaply and so quickly.
Yeah.
And it is a scary landscape. If you just go online, as we all do, you see every brand, everybody out there is producing a video, and everybody has, X, Y, or Z views and hits and likes and all that kind of stuff. And I think if you dig deeper into it, I think that the scariness should subside and excitement should take its place, because it just means that brands are going to want to do more and more and more. And in our opinion, and this goes back to the original question, Justin, of like, how do we enter into a relationship with the brand versus our work with a documentary?
Yeah, I guess as an offshoot of this, and then I want to make sure there's time to open it up for any questions. But an offshoot, in terms of jobs, does it make sense to sort of, because these big corporations and such are now, they're opening up, agencies are opening up their own in-house departments for content creation. Does it make sense for people to think big and to go for major corporations for sort of in-house in-house gigs, or should people be thinking more about smaller production houses where maybe they can get their hands on more at a younger stage? Where do you think it makes sense to look if people are interested in doing this kind of work?
I would think it kind of depends on how you feel creatively. Like for me, I like working and having a lot of creative control, so I don't mind being on a smaller team and kind of having to both pitch and create. But I know that some people like to be a lot more kind of singly focused on their craft. And if you're like, I really love editing, I really love color, it might be better to look within kind of a bigger institution that you aren't required to wear as many hats. But I think it's so interesting that now it's like back to having in-house production companies at all of these corporations, because that totally phased out over the last decade. It used to be all the agencies had in-house production companies and nobody did, and now it's starting to come back. So I think it provides a great opportunity both ways. but it depends on what you're
Because
interested
it's
in.
cheaper now. I mean, in the end, it's because it's cheaper now. The investment for these big companies to make an in-house stuff is far less than it was 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
In the return on their investment is probably higher, at least in terms of how much they put into it.
Absolutely.
You know, so that's probably changed the game a bit. But there's a lot of like big companies that have smaller companies that are really part of the bigger company. Like Great Big Story is funded by CNN, which is funded by Turner. You know, so it's all, you know, it's like they're looked at as an independent thing, but you know, there's some, you know, it kind of goes back and forth about really how independent they are.
Absolutely. And like what's interesting, Justin, is like when I think even within the big companies, if you're interested in being kind of an independent entity, there's still opportunities to collaborate. It's just much more erratic. So like we've done a bit of work with like BBC Storyworks, which likes to see themselves as the competitor to Great Big Story, even though I think Great Big Story is a great bit bigger. And so like they would hire us to go out like into the field and produce the stories.
Yeah.
And then when we send them back to the team in-house, completed, there's probably going through all of like the internal QCs and maybe another round of post.
But I will say that I think that there's definitely a transition that has already started or is happening, where the in-house creative team is way more on the technical side than in the past kind of 10 years it has been. And so if anyone in the room is interested in kind of going into and let's say being a part of CNN Great Big Story, I think that you've got to kind of know what's coming, depending on what company you're applying to. And I guess my statement is that a lot of these companies are looking for very technical people to step in and be able to edit, be able to sound mix, be able to color correct. And the further on that line, down the line you are, not only in terms of competency, but also in terms of like a portfolio that you can show someone, that you can say, I did this whole thing or I did this part of it. I think the better position you would be able to get if you're looking at being a part of an established, let's call it agency, and then agency we can define later if we want to. But the converse of that is, you know, like Megan was saying, is really trying to tackle it from the idea perspective and then going out and saying to a Great Big Story, hey, I have this idea. Will you hire me to do that? Or can I partner with you to produce this together? That's certainly a more difficult procedure, but it's not to say that it hasn't happened and doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So,
it's like 10 or so now. I love the opportunity to sort of open this up. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or anything.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Sure. Oh, of course.
Okay, this is my question.
You're hiding over here. We need to bring you in.
Okay.
We need to bring you in. Hang on.
from afar.
Hi, good morning.
I can't sit in the middle here.
Okay, this is my question. All right.
I'm hiding. I'm going away.
If you were to create a checklist of things that we need to be aware of in order to avert unnecessary lawsuits.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
That's a really good question.
In terms of documentary?
Let's say, in a sense, that, or let's say personally, a music video.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I would go.
All the music and all that, you know.
Yeah, sure. I would, depending on what type of project we were working on, I would have a different approach to kind of my paperwork and my legal. But certainly for anything that, again, we had kind of the benefit in some ways of coming out of a more heavy-handed, like industry-based training at like a TV, where like every single person that appeared on camera had to have a release form that said essentially in perpetuity, and there's probably a lot of these available templates online, you know, in perpetuity, I have the right to be filmed. I'm not being paid, and that you can edit and use this media indefinitely. Those are kind of like the 3 key things I would look for in a release form. If it was something like a music video, I'd also make sure my location release forms were similarly fortified. And then occasionally we work with talent, so to speak. We don't do this as much because, again, we're usually working with real people or artists. But if we were working with like an actor or a model or something like that, that's like kind of another level of appearance and release forms. And a lot of times you get into working with like their agency or their representative, which will provide you the release forms. So what I would make sure when I'm signing those as the production company, like maybe we're signing it for 2 years, online only, global distribution, but no outdoor advertising, like no billboards. I would make sure from a production perspective company that we had something with the client that said, like, this is our understanding of how this media will be used, so that if that model appears on a billboard in Hong Kong in 5 years, that I'm not getting sued, that it goes back to the paperwork that I have signed with the client. So I know that's like a lot of tiers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to step back a second. Like, if you're talking about a client piece that you're doing for another person who's then going to take it and do without asking you and do whatever they want to do with it, then I think your some of your legal documents kind of need to have, as you're saying, a checklist. And one of those is an E&O insurance. So E&O insurance is typically something that used to be just for kind of broadcast stations, right? And there's a bunch of online material to understand what that means, but essentially it means anything that is said in the film or in the piece has been approved or has been
E&O. So like you have to make sure all the information that you create, all the information you present in it is right, is actual, is correct, and then you're not responsible if something is incorrect.
And then, and so that's like a real legal term. I think that what Megan's talking about with usages and rights, that's more of like a bill of sale. So that's really kind of saying to the actor, or even to the, we do it on our documentary projects as well, because, you know, for us, if Netflix did come in and said, here's $30 million, we would want to share some of that with the people whose story we featured. So the usage and rights is really about saying, what we know is that for the next 2 years, we're going to put it on the web. But maybe if Netflix says, oh, now I want it on broadcast, I want to feature it on whatever.
Right.
So that's another one. And then I would say that lastly is the production period that you're doing, having insurance in place for all of those production things. So like workers' compensation, liability, if you're shooting at an old farm or shooting at an old whatever, everything has to be old is what I'm saying.
I think it's, I don't know if you guys, when you did your shoots, you had to deal with insurance situations at all. Obviously, if you haven't, obviously you can go out and get insurance for set periods of time, for set amounts. So that you have to go and get a year's worth of insurance. You can do it just for your production itself. The other thing I want to just add off top of this, and then we can ask anybody else. But one of the points they made in regarding the legal aspect, but which I think is a great point overall, is to understand what the end game for your project is, what your goals are. That not only legally, but sound, how it's shot, how you edit it, how you do the color. I can't tell you how many times I've worked on films for festivals where is it being how the festival works? Is this going to 35 and being projected? Is it being projected in a digital way? Does the place have surround sound so that when I play back my mix, it's going to be accurate? How are these spaces designed? But there's going to be different loudness levels for internet stuff versus film stuff. There's going to be your color is going to be different in terms of like sort of where the end game for the product is. All of these, the music that you put in it, understanding how you've licensed your music, and understanding that if this gets screened, you're going to pay X amount of money. But if this is going online, you're going to be paying another set of money. So it's really great. Obviously, when the production process starts, you don't know ultimately where it's going to go in the long term, but you can have set goals and understanding how you set everything up before those things happen so that you're not caught in a situation where someone says, oh, actually, this is going to cost you another $10,000 or blah, blah, blah. It's just really great to have that stuff all buttoned up ahead of time. Again, not just from a legal standpoint, but in terms of how you're shooting it, how you're doing the edit, how you're doing the mix, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So does anybody else have any questions? Thoughts, concerns, complaints?
Yeah, question.
Neil, where are you? Let's get you, and I got a shift this way. Come on over here. Getting out of the way.
All right. I just had a question about making, when working with your editor or editing a documentary yourself, do you edit each chapter at a time or each sequence at a time, and do you do so chronologically? Do you say like, oh, this will start with this, this family, and then we'll go and see this?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think we've done it many different ways.
Yeah.
And I think the shortest answer would be it's story dependent.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that another way to answer that is it's director dependent. So sometimes directors are on set and they know exactly what they want to do, so they edit chronologically. But sometimes you get footage from a documentary where you weren't present. And so you're editing, but you kind of don't really know if it's chronological or not because you're just trying to find the story within the footage that's been given to you. But I think that, yeah, your editor, if it's not yourself, might have his or her own way of starting as well. But yeah, it's a good question.
And so right now we're working on an independent film that has like 5 different characters that we've been following over like 3 years. And for that, we've been editing non-chronologically. So we've been editing by character, not by time, if that makes sense. And so we're trying to find the story within each of those characters. And then once we have that story, then we're kind of looking at it from a more story arc way. Like, okay, where do we want to mix these together? And then where do we want to keep them intact as like just this character's story?
And I'm going to steal a metaphor that Megan often uses to describe the editing process for a long-form documentary. She often talks about it.
That's a shit show, but I don't know if that's a metaphor.
Elegant metaphor, and I wanted to share it with you.
No, she talks about it as puzzle pieces, as creating a puzzle, right?
It's a collage.
Nice.
Collage. I like puzzle pieces, but the idea being that every minute is one piece, and every minute of one piece, and you've got 3 terabytes of content, and you're really just trying to put it all together to create some puzzle that looks normal, feels like something people will be able to recognize, if that's your goal.
Really nice, yeah. That's tough, yeah, and especially if you're trying to build something that is supposed to be laid out in a chronological order later, but because of the production process or access to people and situations, is out of order. So that's another. You're trying to sort of create the order on the fly, and I'm sure that's obviously. Anybody else have anything they want to ask while we have them here? Kelsey. Oh, by the way, I should just do a proper introduction of everybody. This is Phil, everybody here, and this is Brad and Kelsey and Casey and Sam and Tom C and Tyler and Julia and Mike and Neil and Tommy P and Molly.
Awesome. Nice to meet you, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Sorry. So for my question about documentaries. How do you guys go about choosing like the best quotes or best lines, I guess, from each interview? Do you guys choose that collectively, or what's the process for that? Like, especially with editing as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it depends kind of on your team, but at this stage, we've been working with our editor now for about 5 years, so we're really kind of story-wise in sync. If I was working with an editor that I hadn't worked with before, hadn't worked with a lot, my process would be different. But we really work collaboratively, looking at the quotes. Maybe we'll do a kind of I'll call it like a wide cut, not in terms of like visual, but we'll capture a lot of content in like a rough string out, taking out some of like the fat. So just the basic, stuff that isn't as interesting. And then collectively we would kind of decide, okay, what's the most interesting? A lot of times.
And Meg, I want to pause you really quick. I think that's really great to know is like, if you know your piece needs to be 15 minutes long, don't always aim for 15 minutes. Make sure you get the best stuff out there on the table first. So if you have to lay it out an hour, but it's in the right order, roughly, it's really great to sort of have the fat there to be able to then pick from and reassemble. So don't force yourself into that box at the start. Anyway, that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, that's exactly.
I think I'll also say, Chelsea, that I think a lot of people think that a documentary is just go into a room and press record, and then later you figure out like what happened and what the story was. But I think the reality, at least for us as directors and producers, is you go into that room knowing what you're hoping will happen. In the sense that you're there at a time that you've chosen, which you believe is important for the public or your viewers to see, because it relates to something else that you're trying to communicate, right? And so while the type of filmmaking we like to do is empirical filmmaking, so really finding the story while we're filming, it doesn't mean that we don't have any idea of what we're capturing or why we're capturing something, especially when it comes to interviews, right? A lot of documentaries are really heavily based on interviews and what interviewees are saying to push along the narrative. And while it does, present challenges to find the right quote at the right time within the context of your edit, it doesn't mean that the 45 minutes that you sat down with the director of the WHO didn't have any structure. Like, you knew what you were talking about. And what kind of questions you wanted to ask. So I just wanted to make that point. In addition to what Justin's saying is like, if it's a 10-minute piece, then maybe you don't need to film with 45 people kind of thing,
I'll also add that I really like working from transcripts. That's different from, I'm really verbal in terms of like, I like seeing the words, I like highlighting. So depending on if I'm the lead on the project or if Mike is or our editor is the creative lead, we'll go through different processes. I will typically read all the transcripts, highlight what I like, make a selects of that, and then maybe make a script from that. Our editor is much more like intuitive in the sense he wants to see how it was said and build that way. And so that's kind of two different approaches. But if you do find yourself liking to see the written word, and I think can be more important when you're on a longer piece, because sometimes you're going in 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, and some development happened, and you're saying, did my character say anything about having an allergy or something? Something that you didn't think would be critical is now critical. There's a great service that we use called rev.com, rev.com, and the transcriptions are it's unbelievable. It's like changed the process. They're $1 a minute for English to English not translations, but transcriptions, which is so cheap.
Sometimes we'll leave a foreign country doing the interviews and we'll arrive back into our studio with the transcripts ready.
It's amazing. And so if you do like that part of the process, that is a great service. You can just send them the YouTube link and you get it back within 2 days.
And this comes down to kind of process, right? So before even we touch anything on an edit, like on an actual physical computer, we're doing a paper edit from the content that we created from the interviews, right? So that you can create what that narrative flow looks like on paper.
Yeah, I have to say that I do love outlines. I don't love that I love outlines, but I do.
I know.
But outlines help me just wrap my head around things. I mean, just getting stuff on paper, writing it out, and it has almost for me, I really have to write it, and because I'm older, but I like the process of writing something. It just helps me,
Me too.
keep track of things. We have time for do you have time for maybe one more
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, fine.
question? If there is one more question, Tyler.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi.
I just wanted to. So I was watching one of your films.
Why don't you move up here a little bit further? That's good.
I was watching one of the films, The Commute, and I saw at the end it said the website that you got the music from was called Moby Gratis, which I looked into, and it was a website that Moby offers for free. Sound, film. And so my question was, how did you go about finding that? And is there any other websites or something similar to that?
Yeah. So in terms of music, that's it's one of the moments in a film where you realize, oh my goodness, my film has just changed. The music has changed everything about the film that was either good or bad. Hopefully it goes in the good direction. But how we find, in terms of resources, there's never been more resources right now for cinematic sounding music for free or very, very low cost. And we can follow up with Justin on some of those that we use. For our business side, back to kind of the legal issues, we actually have a blanket policy with Universal Music that allows us to go into their library and use basically, I think they're like 250,000 tracks, each track with like 5 different versions. And we can use that for our commercial clients. We do sometimes use some of that music for our independent films, but oftentimes when we have the budget, what we like to do is we like to commission musicians and composers to come in and compose music for the particular film that we're producing. So that's a big range, in the last 30 seconds. There's free music out there.
And sometimes
you can license
Wiki Commons, but we can send some of the ones.
Yeah, we'll send some of the resources that we at least start, especially for rough cuts. We oftentimes like, or at least our editor, so back to kind of some of this idea of like, where do you start? Our editor oftentimes won't touch the footage until we've confirmed at least a piece or two of music so that he understands kind of like the flow and the vibe. This is usually for the shorter pieces that we do. But when you have the opportunity to compose music, or if you yourself are musicians, what an incredible gift, because it just changes the entire way your audience is going to appreciate the film.
That's a really interesting tidbit about bringing, and I'm always an advocate of this, but of course I'm biased. But trying to think about music, bringing sound design in much earlier into the process. And let's say you have to do a full mix or anything like that, but just being able to shape things artistically with those assets, I think is really helpful. Other than, because very often in the end, I see it all the time, there's a cut and they're like, okay, we have 1 day until this airs, and we need music. We need something, and of course there's no money for it. There's no time. So it's, it's always great to not, and that's why we have this class, is to be able to think about, you don't even need to be an expert in sound mixing or sound design to be able to think about what's in, just thinking about these things, the process, how to speak about them during the process to people you're working with. And also just thinking where it can help you, where it can hurt you, things like that.
Yeah.
Does anybody else? Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up. Guys, this is really great.
Awesome. This was fun.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
And if you have any questions,
for
Justin,
taking the time.
share our contact information too.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Meg.
Oh, I was saying if anybody has any questions after the fact, feel free to share our email addresses and contact information.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.